Welcome to the Anthro to UX podcast, where you will learn how to break into UX with an anthropology degree. Through conversations with leading anthropologists working in user experience, you will learn firsthand how others made the transition, what they learned along the way, and what they would do differently. We will be discussing what it means to do UX research from a practical perspective and what you need to do to prepare a resume and portfolio. I'm your host, Matt Artz, a business anthropologist specializing in design anthropology and working at the intersection of product management, user experience, and business strategy. Let's get started. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Matt Artz of Anthro to UX. Today, I'm here with Ender Ricart. Ender is a UX researcher at Google, currently, previously at LivePerson, Amazon, and Anthro Tech in the Seattle-ish area. So, Ender, thanks for joining me today. As I do with everyone, could you please let us know a little bit about your journey first into anthropology?
Sure, and thank you for having me, Matt.
Pleasure.
So I graduated from the University of Chicago in 2015, did a brief stint as a postdoc in Japan, and then realized I didn't want to stay in academia, just given the current lack of demand for Japan area studies specialties was not really a thing in the United States, and wanted to start a family, wanted to have stability in my life, not move around every other month or every other year. So got a job through a previous advisor that was working at a nonprofit called Battelle in the area of aging. So it was a good bridge to non-academia and was specifically in the healthcare space. So I did that for a year, but being in the Seattle area, there is a lot of tech, and I kept hearing about this thing called UX. There are a lot of meetup events, and I attended one of those, and people were referring to themselves as anthropologists, even though they had only taken Intro to Cultural Anthropology 101 in undergrad. And I was thinking to myself, well, I actually am an anthropologist, so if I were to get into this field, wouldn't that be great? So I started to look for jobs, and funny enough, there's a company called Anthro Tech, great company. It's a smaller agency in the Seattle area, and they had an opening, and that's my entrance into UX. And I had a lot of great opportunities to try out a lot of different projects, a lot of variety of methodologies and collaborations with different UX professions like design and like management and quantitative UX. And so it was like a rapid hands-on course in UX research. And from there, I wanted to stay in UX, but go more towards emerging technologies. Another aspect of my dissertation was on science and technology studies. So I wanted to get back into that space. I always find it very intriguing how humans interact with technologies, especially when there isn't a precedence in mental models for engaging with that technology, to really understand how to build one, how to work with existing patterns of engagement and build out an experience from there. And so I went into Amazon. I worked on Alexa, which is their conversational AI, and was there for a year, after which I moved to LivePerson, which was conversational AI as well. And now I'm in the cloud space at Google.
Yeah, very cool. Well, thanks for the introduction. And there's a lot to dig into there. So to kind of go back to the PhD a bit. So, you kind of knew that you didn't want to stay in academia, and you reference the lack of jobs, which is, quite frankly, one of the reasons for starting, this podcast, right? To try and help people realize earlier on in their process that there are these other jobs out there, because so many people graduate and then are kind of looking around and trying to sort of figure out what to do next, since there are fewer jobs today in academia, many fewer. And then at that point, you have to try and figure out, things pretty late in the game, and you're already looking for a job, so it's kind of difficult, right? And so to just focus on that a bit, you thankfully sort of learn through some connections like a path forward, but of course not everybody does. So what do you think coming from like a kind of classical kind of anthropology PhD program, what do you think we could be doing different in that space that might help better train anthropologists to get into work like UX?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. I did end up having a pretty smooth transition, but there were a good 6 months before. So basically, once I started my postdoc, before then I knew I didn't want to continue down the academic path. And I spent a good 6 months of that postdoc also applying to jobs and trying to figure out how to translate my 3-page CV. Like academic CVs is like every possible thing you've ever written or presented, and you have to get it down to 1 page. And then even now I struggle with this idea of like impact. Like constantly people are like, but what's the impact? And I'm like, I wrote it. It's right there. That's the impact. I don't understand what you're saying. And like I must be missing some step about like impact, but it was really rough. And it was a lot of me hunting down like articles about how to go from academia to like work in a company and business sector. And it was really stressful, like psychologically as well, because you feel like you're failing. Like I should be getting a job at, I graduated from the University of Chicago, so I should be like the elite higher opportunity anywhere. But that's not the case. And it doesn't matter how sexy your research is. Like you're still going to be most likely the person that has to go from assistant professor position or visiting professor, visiting faculty, moving around a lot. And there's no stability in your work life. Like you work at all hours, even over summer vacation. And I really wished that somebody, when I was a grad student, even just had like a workshop or casual like career fair where I wasn't scared to go to the career fair. Like there were like some things about alternative careers, but it was like too shameful to reveal that you were looking at something other than the hallowed halls of academia for your future, which I get it. Like you're spending grant money, you're consuming something that should be for someone. I mean, this is like the idea. This Fulbright scholarship should be for somebody that's doing research to contribute back to society in some way. But that's not even what a lot of Fulbright scholars who are anthropologists end up doing. They just write a book that no one else can read except for another anthropologist. Anyway, I digress. But I do wish that there was just a class, like the anthropology of UX research or how to do UX research. There's so much value that anthropology could bring to UX research if it was just more clearly articulated, both on the institution side of the university and also on the corporate side where they hire these anthropologists that have PhDs at lower levels because they're like, oh, well, you have, quote, 10 years of experience being a graduate student, but we don't know that you can actually perform in a corporate setting. So we're going to put you at junior UX researcher and pay you extremely low because you're so desperate for a job. Yeah, that's always what happens.
That's tough. So you mentioned a course. So do you think a course is enough, or do you think, there's something else that would help?
It would be a start. I think it would also need to be some cross-pollination in systems of knowledge, both educating UX researchers that aren't anthropologists about some of the basic practices of anthropology beyond field research or beyond ethnography. Like I get ethnography is a big deal in UX research and obviously in anthropology, but there's so much more that you learn when you're in a PhD program or a master's program about different theoretical frameworks to apply, how to abstract patterns and connect them up to like more general principles of social practice. So I think that some of that work could be broken down into a course. I took theory and practice. I took, methods when I was in anthropology program, and that's not something that I hear anyone in UX research talking about. And like how to do analysis and how to write reports and communicate insights.
Yeah, and communicate succinctly, right, for a business context as opposed to massive textual document.
300-page dissertation. Yeah.
Again, that nobody reads in the end. I mean, there's a lot of people in business who end up not reading things, but at least it's short. They can flip through, see some things on the deck. But obviously we, courses would help. Cross-pollination, as you say. One thing I do think was very valuable from the program I went through, which was UNT, was the applied projects. Each course, at least like, not the core courses, if you will, but like the sort of specialization that you were in. So business, tech, design for me. All those courses had projects. So you really were applying the knowledge in a real life context. And even though it wasn't framed as UX, the practice of going through it with companies like Baylor Health or other sort of businesses was, good to see how it sort of functions in the real life, in the real business world, if you will. But there is certainly more, obviously, that can be done. Recent episode, with Liz Rodwell, we're talking about, education and bringing in, certain, more UX kind of courses and maybe even a track right into the process. And it does seem like there's now a few people talking about these things and we're at the start of it. But there is also the opportunity for, a lot of us in UX to also contribute back to theory and to be publishing, maybe not just in anthropological journals, but, in others, outside of our field. It could be HCI, but, just broadly speaking, there's plenty of places. And so have you thought about doing any of that, or any thoughts on how we could contribute in that way?
Yeah. In part, I'm waiting till my kids are a little bit older, but I do have aspirations of contributing back to the industry, to thought leadership, to contributing to a voice and a face of how to bring together some of the more classic anthropological trainings to a space like UX research, and just what I've learned as a profession in this profession over the last several years, working for some interesting technologies. But yeah, I have a really hard time with a lot of the UX research publications. I don't know, like, I really hate empathy, and I really hate the way we talk about ethnography. And if I have to keep talking about like the user and the user experience and user journeys, I don't know. I gotta pivot at some point, because it does get me really, gets me in knots.
Well, yeah, and maybe that's a opportunity though for you to kind of carve out your own niche in some of that literature and help make it a little bit more rigorous.
Yeah. I am thinking about. I've been trying to like carve out time to write a book on analytical practices, like how to do analysis in UX, because like I mentioned earlier, there isn't really much discussion on that or much literature on the how-to of doing analysis and the different frameworks that you can bring to the table to find some key patterns that would speak to like focused impact. And that's, or even what you're doing in an unintentional way, could potentially bias if you're not aware of the different approaches that you put onto the work you're doing.
Well, I would certainly look forward to seeing that book. But to go back for the moment to the work you did, we all have lots of things we probably want to get to. Hopefully, some of those projects come to light one day. No, that's usually the case for most people I talk to. I have my own, of course.
Yeah.
But so curious to go back to the PhD research. So it was in assistive technology. So given there, the tech component, if you will, did much of that work prep you in any way for UX?
It gave me, at a minimum, a shiny exterior to recruiters, I would say, to be able to talk about assistive technologies in my resume and say that I worked on incorporation of assistive technologies to home modifications, and also in assisting older adults in taking part in society and being mobile without having to create a conforming physical environment. It was, I think, sexy enough to intrigue someone that is picking up applicants to say, oh, this person has, quote, practical experience doing research in tech. Yeah.
And, correct me if I'm wrong, because I definitely have never looked into assistive technology, but I'd imagine some of it is actually like quite, quote unquote, low tech from an information technology perspective, where maybe some others is, more, IT related. And so was it just sort of the word technology that was in there that kind of wowed them, if you will, or kind of helped convince them of that? Or was it were you actually doing more kind of information technology work that, was maybe more directly translatable?
I can't speak for the recruiters, but I did in my presentations when I did apply for jobs and had to rely on that to speak to what I was doing for the last 8 years. I did talk about the emotional impact and sense of identity that older adults have as they move from independence to dependence. There's a shift where they become almost no longer people because there's a system that they just kind of insert into, which is the social healthcare system. And they have an orbiting team of healthcare providers or technology that guides them through their home, blocks them out of different places, and they're, in some cases, non-vocal because they can't talk anymore. But even when they can talk, they remain silent. And that was my experience with them, was that they were no longer people. And instead they were part of an assembly of technologies that shunted them around to different places. And there was a lot of anxiety for people that were on the cusp of that was their future, and they would do anything to not succumb to that situation.
Yeah, and I think understandably so, right? And it's interesting that
I would too.
Yeah, no, I obviously not having that conversation every day, but the thought of it is always a little. The thought of aging is always a little difficult. Now, you continue doing some work in public health, and was that work, again, was that sort of related at all to tech, or?
It did not relate to tech. So the work was more focused around research for Medicare, Medicaid, other governmental organizations. And I ended up being on a number of projects, one of which included a lot of focus groups and qualitative data analysis and a report write-up. And a lot of it, other than that, was going through literature reviews and identifying keywords and then marking a spreadsheet as yes or no that keyword was present. So it didn't feel like it was a very engaging exercise of my mental capacities at the time. So I wanted something a little more engaging.
So what I find interesting about all of this, though, is, so The PhD work is, I mean, of course, we know that a lot of companies, they don't always look at sort of graduate studies as, as you already said, like despite all the years of experience, you don't necessarily have the experience that they're looking for. Then you kind of come out and you end up in public health where, yes, there's, arguably some research involved, but not the kind of research you were maybe hoping for, but nonetheless a little bit of research, but also not quite like what's happening in tech. And then you were able to pivot into tech. You were able to reframe all of that and pivot into tech, which of course is, it's great that it happened for you. But I'd like to maybe hear a little bit more about how you did that and like maybe some of the struggles even as you were applying. And so like how, did you learn anything by going through that process about how you took that? Because I think what's particularly interesting, as I already said, is like, you left and then went into public health and then to tech. And so you had a kind of a stopover. Some people, they graduate and they kind of look around for a while and they make it to tech. But you have this sort of in-between phase where, you had to kind of help reframe all of that. So again, I know I sort of said it twice, but anything that was learned particularly from that you could share that might help others?
Sure. Let's see. I didn't know about UX prior, so I had no idea what an anthropologist could do other than research in a different way. So because my dissertation was on the science of aging, which is gerontology, so I studied with gerontologists in Japan and similarly in the United States, had a couple of contacts that were gerontologists. So it was a pretty logical bridge if I, as an anthropologist, study more of the social aspects of aging and can contribute to how to effectively communicate the importance of health programs to keep older adults healthy in the United States. That was something I could do. I, like many other anthropologists, had a personal inspiration to study aging, which was looking for different role models in how to age gracefully and a way to be okay with the aging process, having seen my grandmother go through Alzheimer's and the difficulty of experiencing that through my mother's eyes. And so once I finished my dissertation, that part of my life was kind of done. And I realized I didn't want to keep doing aging. And I definitely didn't want to stay scanning documents for keywords and filling out a spreadsheet. So I had to look for something else. And in looking for that, like typing in the keyword researcher into LinkedIn or Glassdoor, I kept coming across UX research. And the more I read about it, the more I realized that I do that. Like, I did that, I do that. That's me. So it was a matter of getting the language. I had to translate between first anthropology to public health, which is like 50% of the way. Then from public health to UX, which is like another 50% where you put in some other keywords like passion for the user or works well in ambiguity, like things like that. And then it was like just Tetris pieces fitting into place. Yeah.
There's still no quantified impact there.
Yeah, we can talk for an hour about what is quantification, what is impact, and I probably won't arrive at an answer.
Yeah, I know it's funny. I mean, even when coaching people, I often do try to tease out, sort of numbers because there is such a bias towards seeing that kind of stuff in resumes. But there's an irony in it, like coming out of like, a program where you're more or less, most of the time at least, right? Most people are kind of focused on qualitative. Of course, some people get into more kind of mixed methods, but so there's a sort of an irony in teasing that out. But there is, of course, many ways to do it, including like, what's the funding of, behind the PhD, right? And in
Yeah.
terms of giving a scope of the size of the project and how many participants, and there is lots of tangible things in like the research
Yeah.
that, especially PhD students do, but even master's students who have applied projects, and there is really good stuff in there to bring into the resume, but it is at first kind of there's always like a little resistance there, which is kind of
Yeah.
interesting.
But also, you just don't even know that you're supposed to translate that stuff. Like, I didn't even think at the beginning, like, oh, I designed, executed, and analyzed a qualitative study that involved 120 older adults in a foreign language. Was like, that's like just one statement. And it's like, I mean, that should earn me like a senior UX researcher position anywhere, like automatic pass. And yeah.
I would think, but need a few more bullets.
I know. Yeah. One bullet.
So, so now pivoting, to UX. So you had this interest in emerging technologies, and so you end up working in conversational AI, right? And I'm kind of skipping, like, the Anthrotech experience here, but you end up working in conversational AI, which is super cool. It's emerging now. There's obviously probably lots of sort of questions to dig into there, some of which are, I'm sure, concerning in terms of like greater impact. But it is nonetheless. If you're interested in emerging tech, it's obviously a fun tech to sort of be involved researching and playing with. And so, is there anything particular about that interested you? Is there anything reason to move from health to that, or
Yeah.
did you just sort of stumble into a cool opportunity?
I kind of stumbled into that. I did originally want to get into like AR and VR because I wanted to get in more into physical, like wearable technology, where there is whole body beyond just like how people think about it or behave around it. And I've always been interested in creating new forms of interaction, creating new types of mental models. I didn't know at the time that conversational AI would bring that experience, but it did ultimately. It was, especially with the technology like Alexa, where people are newly starting to interact with it. They're trying to push the boundaries of that engagement. There was a lot of question on a lot of hypotheticals around how people would respond and how people would interact with this technology, this identity. And you can't just ask participants, like, what would you do? Or what would you, like, how would you react? And so I kind of came up with a good formula for getting pretty close to how they would earnestly respond and react by building out a full picture of their expectations, the existing mental model that they were applying, and what that meant for how they were going to at first interact and respond, and then how we could incrementally build from there, and educate and inform. And it's something that I still apply even in cloud technologies when we're thinking ahead of a new product launch. How can we ground it in the present, but still have a close proximity for the future hypothetical of that interaction?
While working with conversational AI, I know you had the opportunity to contribute to a patent. And so obviously we can't go into the details of the patent. However, what I'd like to maybe pick your brain on is like with the role of a UX researcher in contributing to a patent, because there's all these there's all these opportunities for us in an organization that are often, that we're not maybe realizing yet. That's maybe the opportunity to contribute more to strategy or more to leadership. And so, as you're the first person I've had the opportunity to talk to, at least that I know has contributed to a patent. I'd like to get a little understanding of how you think you can bring the work you did. Again, not the details of your work, but like, the process and the way of thinking to contributing to something like, intellectual property.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk kind of a broader circle around that research as well, because I have published on it in a Medium post about conversational AI and the work that I did this was with LivePerson, where we were working on customer support chatbots and some of the conversational ML algorithms that train the AI to react and respond. And they sold a software as a service that can be implemented by different companies to build out a conversational design and a chatbot for their specific company. So there's like a whole product as well as like the chatbot. And so I was doing research there on kind of what I brought to the table, I guess, was the realization that you can't just create the chatbot without looking at the interaction between the agent, which is the customer service representative, and the customer as like two parts of the same coin. So almost like a dialectic, if you will, except there's no master or slave in this situation. But they're equal parts conversational partners, and the context of that conversation is built through their interaction. And so rather than training an ML algorithm solely on the agent's input and your assumption of how the customer will respond, instead train the algorithm on the dynamics of that conversation as the two parties, how they pair together, and incorporate that into the software as something that you could validate and quality check as an agent going through the conversation. And so that was the basis for the patent. I worked closely with engineers one engineer in particular, to brainstorm this based on the research insights from UX research that I performed, some foundational work. And yeah, it was really interesting and exciting to have a seat at the table and think about real implications of qualitative research on the core product that the company is building and selling.
Yeah, no, it's great. So often, a lot of researchers don't always get to have that seat at the table. Some don't even really get to see kind of, their insights really even translate to anything. It might get sort of watered down or even left out, in the product process, depending on the sort of organization, the organization of the team, I should say. And so that, being involved in that is really interesting. Is there anything that you learned, from contributing to intellectual property that you think, all of us researchers should be thinking about? And, is there anything that you would maybe suggest to somebody else to do?
I mean, that's a difficult one. I don't think that I have any kind of special sauce, but I am very persistent when it comes to the interpretation of my research insights. So by persistent, I mean, I want to make sure that people are interpreting it appropriately and not just appropriating parts of it for their own purpose. So I will basically invite myself to meetings by being like, what's going on in there? Or where are you going now? Or like telling people they need to include me so that I can be the advocate for what are the material implications. And also, even outside of my research, if there's a conversation going on where someone's saying, well, users don't like this, or users are going to do X, Y, and Z, if there isn't a grounding in actual data, qualitative or quantitative, then that's an opportunity to advocate for, like, even bringing awareness. Like, hey, you don't know this. You don't know that that's how people will respond. Or like we have assumed that these companies know their users best and can craft a conversational AI that will be relatively successful to accommodate customer service questions and needs. But they're not conversational designers, and they're not agents most of the time. They're different users, so different job roles. So there are all these like contextual factors that you wouldn't think about. Much like I didn't think about UX as a job career, because it wasn't made available to me.
So aside from being persistent and sort of making sure that you're in the room, one of the things I find is it's not just it's not just being in the room at like the start, right? But it's oftentimes sort of reminding everybody over a long period of time, constantly sort of shopping the findings around, making sure that you really persistently stay in front of them, even for something you did, somewhere in the past. And so, obviously making sure that you are in the room as frequently as possible helps. But there is still, there's always the problem that we seem to have, like anthropology has this problem, terribly so. But even, broadly speaking, it seems like our industry has still the problem of trying to convince others of the value of our research. And depending on, the team you're working with and kind of like the biases of the organization, that's, maybe more or less so. I've heard like sort of stories of organizations which were, say, started by designers, which have a tendency to be maybe more friendly, whereas like some that are started by engineers, like there's almost like a culture that grew up around that of sort of like engineering kind of quant bias, right? And so depending on where you are, we may or have to advocate for our work more frequently or not. And so I'm wondering, like, have you experienced any of that? And like, how do you approach that? How do you communicate it? Because you've now gone through a few translation exercises in your career, and so I'm wondering what kind of, what have you learned that might help others better sell their results within the organization?
Move somewhere where there's already a centralized practice of UX and extend the middle finger and peace out. I mean, it is exhausting. Like, anytime I get a new team or like a new member on a team that doesn't have experience, you forget. Like, there's, I would say, selective amnesia of having to go through all the basics of like, no, I am not a designer. I don't just do usability tests. Yes, I can create a user journey, but there are other tools I have in my toolkit. Yes, you need to read the whole report. Please do attend some of the sessions. Please don't interrupt I don't know how many times I've worked with somebody for like a whole year, and then they asked me to do design, like to just mock up some designs. And it's like, I literally worked with you for forever on this project as a researcher, and now you are asking for designs. When did this, like, how did I, anyway. So I don't know. I'm constantly doing translation work, and I end up, for lack of a more applicable word, mansplaining the difference between qualitative research and quantitative research, and how even quantitative research applies numerous analytical lenses to derive significance that renders it even questionable if some of those insights are valid, because you could do enough massaging with it that you could find anything. Or like a survey is almost as dangerous as it is beneficial, depending on how you structure it. And no, I'm not going to do a usability study because you don't even know who your user is. So there's all of this, like, I'm the subject matter expert and that is my job. And if they don't know and they want to work with me, then I have to educate them, and they need to take the time to try and understand.
Yeah, which sadly
is
doesn't
really,
always happen. So it
it
is,
doesn't always happen.
it can be challenging still. I mean, of course, there has been, over the past period of, more recent period of time, a growing interest and understanding of what we all do, but it is not even close to where it would be for, say, a designer. Our
Yeah.
maturity level is still sort of far behind the design teams which are hired first. So, for anybody listening, there is, of course, work to do in our space, but it is doable and we do get to make some good impact here and there. And so I'm wondering if I can ask this, I'm not sure if you can answer or not, but in the conversational AI space, well, actually, first quick question. Was it for B2B or B2C? The
So the Amazon was B2C. Live Person was B2B to C,
Got it.
because business to business to the customer. Yeah.
So I'm just curious, and you don't have to speak of which company you did the research at, and if you can't answer, that's fine. But I'm wondering, do you find that people like dealing with chatbots? And like other, whether, well, say Alexa, like whether it's like, a voice interface or like on the sort of the support side, like a chatbot. I'm just curious to know, like, if that's a good experience for people.
I went through a lot of chat transcripts, and some people are really angry, and some people are really hilarious. But interestingly enough, when you do interview people about interacting with a conversational AI, like a chatbot, they're like, yeah, it makes sense. Like I originally looked through your FAQs. I didn't find the answer. And if I want to call someone, like the chatbot will take me there if they can't answer it. So they seemed reasonable with talking to a chatbot. I went in checking my bias at the door, which is that I vehemently hate talking to chatbots. And why would you ever be like actively try to talk to a chatbot except to, I don't know, have a laugh. So I was kind of shocked to find that the people I did speak with were like, yeah, this is what I was looking for. Yeah.
Obviously, my experience doesn't say anything about the greater, about the greater population. But what I have found is if I get stuck in a dead end of only tech, it has not been enjoyable. But like you said, the ones where if I can't get my answer, then I can get basically a human on the in the chat
Yeah.
window. It that never bothered me so much. But getting stuck there and not getting any answer and having no other recourse and feeling like there's no other way to get in touch with an organization has been very frustrating in the past. But so I guess what I'm trying to get is I can see like, the efficiency that it can bring to sort of narrow down. But still, does seem like one of those things that when you do need to talk to a human, right? I mean, support is such a sort of human endeavor in many ways, right?
Yeah.
To people helping each other, that it seems like when you need that help, it is nice to be able to reach out to an actual human in the end. But
there's no money in that, right? Like that's
Yeah.
that was kind of like everyone understood it, even the customers. Like they're like, well, it's in the company's favor to have chatbots because they don't have to support live agents or outsource live agents, and so there is this temporal aspect to it of I can have this conversation with the chatbot for either immediate help or support or also deferral. Like if the chatbot can't help me, it creates a log and a living agent will reach out to me either in email, by phone call, or through this chat to support me. And that was the most successful mix of like, hey, I'm going to throw my complaint out there. I don't have to get all frustrated because I'm having an argument with a chatbot, and just wait for somebody to come back and help me.
Yeah, it's funny that what you brought up there because in my graduate research, which was on genetics, I found an interesting thing where people, it's just like you said, in many ways, people understood that companies were going, well, even though they didn't read the terms of service and privacy policy, and many of them did not realize that their data could be used for a whole slew of things. They then came to like an acceptance of it because it sort of made
Yeah.
sense from the company perspective, which is interesting how we then, and maybe this extends to many areas, but it's interesting how we then sort of rationalize it from the economic perspective, but in favor of the
Yeah.
company, as opposed
I
to
know.
our own needs and benefits. Probably a whole big conversation in its own right, and one for another time. But
I've seen that though, like broadly in research, like just people like users or customers will basically blame, like take on the onus or take on the blame. And I'm not talking about any specific research, just generally research. Will take on the onus and the blame for like, I probably just don't understand it. Or I'm probably just looking in the wrong place. Or maybe you're already doing this and I just haven't found it yet. So there's always this like willingness to take on the blame rather than accuse the company of having like mistaken or overseen, like overlooked some aspect.
It's interesting. It's definitely something to keep in mind. The way they rationalize that, and so that brings up. So speaking of, researching with users of systems. So you mentioned sort of B2B, B2C and B2B2C, but now at Google, you're doing B2B, and so there's differences in that type of research. And, again, we don't have to go into the specifics per se of the products and the findings, but I'd like to maybe touch on like what that research looks like because I get to work on both and they are both interesting, but they both are a little, they're different. There are, challenges in each for sure. And so it's the kind of thing that when I'm like sort of coaching somebody, it's one of those things that I think somebody should understand, like what kind of products they want to work on, who are the quote unquote users, right? Who are the humans that are going to use it? Because even though the type of research you get to do and who you really might have access to or not changes in those situations. And like the way even some of the expectations around what these products should do for you change. Like again, the kind of like the rationalization we were just talking about. And so I'm wondering, in your experience, now that you're sort of working in B2B with cloud, have you learned anything by switching and going, directly in that space that's sort of different from anything that touched consumer before?
Yeah, I would say context is much more significant. Like previously, context was about like the physical environment and like other things like their technological prowess and familiarity with new technologies. With cloud, it's no longer an individual that is the sole agent or has the agency to power their behavior and their decisions. There's more of like a polyvocal influence to their behavior, where you're looking at the company, their bottom line, their culture, organizational structure, their technological prowess, let alone the individuals, and even their philosophy. Like there's companies that have different philosophies, and it comes out in how they're making decisions with purchasing and using technologies. So it becomes, in an interesting way, more complex because you have to untangle a lot more variables to identify the locus of change or like the source of behavior and intentionality. but it also makes it a lot more frustrating sometimes because like you do have to go the extra mile to make sure you're reaching the right people. There's always a buffer layer, like there's sales representatives, there's agents that are like correspondents and handlers of the customers, and you have to work through them to get the right people, or you have to work through a recruitment agency, and it's kind of like a crapshoot what you end up with. Like you could get somebody that says they use these 3 cloud providers, and then you talk with them and, it turns out that they just installed Google Cloud yesterday on their home computer. And so they got into the study, and you just wasted, $75 and an hour of your time. So it just makes everything more of a process and more of a labor of love. I like it because I like complexity, as maybe other anthropologists might find that they are called to complex spaces to find out, like, poke it, figure out what's going on under the surface, and find the pulse.
Sure.
Yeah.
I know it is interesting. And there's a lot of opportunity to look at the power dynamics in it all. You mentioned organizational culture. And so I've always found it interesting. And you also kind of said, like, who do you get access to, right? And so there's like the leadership that might not want you to have access to certain people for maybe because it reflects poorly on them, or like there's the sort of boots on the ground that don't want to say something because they're scared of what leadership might think, right? And there's all these interesting the politics of it becomes very interesting, and if you're intrigued by that stuff, it is quite fun. Though it is sometimes, like you said, it's sometimes hard to get to the right people to really find out what you need to find out. And so it's not one of those things that's better or the worst per se, right? It's just different, but it is interesting, and I think so frequently it's the consumer products that are sort of flashy that catch a lot of attention, in sort of news. But I think the B2B space is actually a really good one for anthropologists, particularly because of some of those organizational components. You can think of like bringing like a more kind of classic like organizational anthropology in, as much as like sort of like some of the design anthropology elements that overlap nicely with UX. And so I also think, just related to that, I think like product management is a great space for anthropologists because, again, you're sort of servant leader, you're sort of pulling together all these teams that you don't directly lead, and so you got to understand sort of how to work together, be the culture broker. And so there's a lot of areas that it doesn't always have to be UX research, or it doesn't just have to be contributing to sort of usability, right? It is, you can contribute to intellectual property, to strategy. You can work in these organizational spaces. There's a lot of room out there for us, for sure. One of the things about the podcast, I'm hoping to kind of tease out all of that. So I'm glad that we got to just briefly touch on B2B a little bit. One of the other things I'd maybe like to hear more about. So you're on a panel coming up on Tuesday.
Yeah, so this event, obviously this being July, it's Pride Month, and just in the nick of time, we're having an event about Pride in UX in particular. So myself and other UX professionals are going to be talking about their experiences, and both positive and negative, with being in a position of being genderqueer or transsexual, or being a group that isn't often identified and given space and voice to talk. So like the example I always give is like there's tons of like women in tech events going on, and I get invited to these. I'm a non-binary person, and I get invited to them because they're supposed to be diversity, equity, and inclusion events that are for women in tech, but anyone can join. And that's that's not okay. I don't want to just be a part of somebody else's movement. I don't want to be just a part of, and women in tech and other groups. And so this is really about like, let's bring attention to what those and other groups are. Let's speak out and talk about what it's like to work in a company, what it's like to advocate for your identity, and what are some of the concerns that others that work in this profession have around that. And one thing in particular that I wanted to talk about was also, so I'm going to talk a little bit about like empathy in UX and this often call to action that UX professionals have to be the user's advocate and to build empathy for the user, but it doesn't really capture the humanitarian and human rights call to action that empathy in a broader world context does today, to understand the situation that people are, as a whole person, engaging with society and their sense of self in society. And I just don't use empathy anymore. I try not to use empathy because I don't like, we don't need to use the word empathy. It's just because it's sexy and it has this indexicality to like humanitarian and human rights. So that's not what we're doing. We're time on task and like user needs and making a profit for a company. So let's not cheapen it. So that's something I'll talk about.
You know, it all sounds interesting. So just quick thought from you. So, you know, it's funny because despite like the critique of the word empathy, as you said, we are, you know, supposed to be, you know, giving voice to, you know, all these quote unquote users, right? All these humans out there.
Yeah.
But the, you know, the industry itself is not always like the most inclusive. And, you know, our research panels are not always the most inclusive. And so aside from, you know, being better in our hiring and the way we discuss identity and like being better in like, you know, our recruitment, what do you think, you know, what do we really need to do? I mean, of course, you know, the things I said are important, but is there something else that like that we can take the conversation further than that, you know, and you know, have a kind of critical conversation, but also one that leads to like very sort of tangible outcomes, like or tangible next steps?
Man, I feel like then I would have like the key to the city. If I had an answer to that, I actually don't have an answer of like, the only thing that I know to do is what I can, which is to take part in these events and to, because I have learned that I'm more of an outgoing person than most people, even though I would not characterize myself as outgoing. I'm more vocal, and I can then at least be a voice and a face for others that are in a position or in a place to be a voice and a face and represent what I hope would be a growing number of people that, I mean, for me, it's a political move. Like I identify as non-binary because I don't think there should be any need to identify as any one thing, gender-wise. And so rather than take on a host of presuppositions about who I am as a person because I am classified as a woman, my political move is to say, well, no, you can't classify me as a woman or a man. I'm non-binary, and I don't know what that means, and you don't know what that means, and you'll just have to deal with me. And I'm just going to talk and talk and talk until other people start talking, and then I'm just drowned out by the general consensus. So, yeah.
So oftentimes, yeah, there are many people who are interested in such Interested in bringing their voice out. Maybe they're disempowered for some reason. Maybe they sort of lack avenues to do this, and so I'm wondering if other people want to contribute to the conversation like you are. Your event is with Tech Circus, so maybe that's some space that people can look in the future. But where else might people want to kind of contribute to this conversation that would be helpful?
I think at their workplace, that's a good place to start. It's a good time. There's a lot of public scrutiny on companies to do right by their employees. HR is HR, but they also have to toe the company line. So if there's enough of a groundswell of voices, then I think that standards and perceptions and expectations will start to have to shift with it. So educating, learning, even for this, talking at events for me, I'm learning, this is a new space for me, and I'm sure I'll mess up and say stuff that's just as bad as what we're trying to talk against, and become a better person for it. So talk about it, talk to others about it, be schooled, be aware is the best that we can do at this point.
Surinder, thanks very much. Appreciate your time. I guess the last thing, though, is, of course, if somebody wants to reach out to you, where can they find you?
They can mail me via snail mail. No, I'm joking. LinkedIn would be a good place. I'm still quasi-active on there. I'm trying to get away from it, but that's a good place to hit me up. And from there, we can take it off to a different channel.
Very cool. Great. Thanks. Appreciate your time. It was great talking with you.
Yes. Thank you so much, Matt.
Thank you all for listening to the Anthro to UX podcast. To learn everything you need to break into UX, visit anthro2ux.com. There you will find all the podcast episodes and career coaching resources. Please like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.